I've made little secret of my affinity for the fighting genre of video games, and with that in mind, it may be no surprise that little changes when you switch the subjects of that fighting from people to cars, more often than not driven by people. The car combat subgenre combines battle royales, fighting games, and shooters with the physics and needed accuracy of vehicular transit to create something rather unique. The undeniable granddaddy of car combat is none other than Twisted Metal. And there are pretenders and distaffs here and there, but none made their claim for fame and distinction quite like the underappreciated wildcard Vigilante 8. In our landscape as is today, where not even Twisted Metal gets the prestige it deserves, it's needless to say that Vigilante 8 is a franchise unheard of for years now. Which is a shame because there's a whole lot to love about this modest franchise. You'd think with something as specific as ballistic demolition derbies, it's hard to create an experience that's truly different from the titles it gained inspiration from, such as Twisted Metal. But while that series' atmosphere was hard rock and derby mud with an edge of twisted insanity, Vigilante 8, intentionally or otherwise, made distinguished choices to set itself apart. For Twisted Metal, variety is the spice of life. Drivers from every background gather to fight to the explosive death for their desired wish, an incredibly diverse cast with equally bombastic cars, duking it out in famous locations all over the world, created the chaotic dish that was Twisted Metal. Whether it was ice cream trucks in Holland or construction vehicles in Tokyo, the tournament was a veritable who's who of intense destruction. Vigilante 8 actively subverted these ideas and in the best way possible. Rather than casting the widest net for cars and environments possible, Vigilante 8 set out to capture a particular atmosphere and do it extremely well, namely the US rural desert in the year 1975. These parameters gave Vigilante 8 its incredibly vintage tone, with a clear love for the various corners of 70s culture, from the blaxploitation hero John Torque to the disco enthusiast Boogie. You never traveled all the way to New York or Paris the way you would in Twisted Metal, but you did experience the extremely atmospheric deserts, casinos, and oil plants of the American Southwest. And rather than archetypes like the cop driving the cop car and the race car driver driving the race car, the vehicles in Vigilante 8 were more personal, feeling more like decked out and hands-on cars that we'd more honestly end up in if we were spurned into car combat, such as Sheila's haphazardly souped-up dune buggy, donned by the young girl with a Joe Boxer sticker and racing stripes, to the tenured and practical pickup truck complete with a camper for supplies driven by the more rustic beeswax. These were combatants that told Vigilante 8's colorful and surprisingly enthralling parable. When the megacorporation Omar hires the auto mercenary team called the Coyotes, led by the vile Sid Byrne, to terrorize every other distributor of oil out of business, the steering wheel fondling saboteurs are giddy to carry out their orders. However, they misstep when they set their reticles on the modest business of the unpushable Convoy, who assembles his own team of auto enthusiasts to combat the Coyotes as the Vigilantes. Contrary to the every man for himself atmosphere in other car combat rings, the cast of Vigilante 8 are divided into a battle between good and evil, creating an interesting camaraderie between the characters to explore, not just via how the characters wind up in their respective alignments, but the star-crossed rivalries formed across the two factions, such as the deranged Coyote Loki, a former aircraft tester who covets an even more advanced vessels to fly, who sets his sights on the alien-chasing hippie of the Vigilantes, Dave, who's been using his radar technology for his UFO sighting. The dichotomy between the light and dark side of the auto war is really well defined, because the characters are so well developed, even for the little chance they get to display their personalities. The cast of characters is cohesive in that they're clearly from the same world, to the point that it might be hard to guess who's good or bad if I show the characters without the context of their faction alignment. But their respective team leaders, the humble but stirring Convoy and the self-serving Sid Byrne, alone paint a picture of small man-made business versus corporate terrorism, and you can see these motivations ripple into the designs, personalities, and motives of their drivers within their respective loyalties. Vigilante 8's compelling stories and characters were only a backdrop for the highly addictive gameplay. It functions a great deal like other car combat games, but with competitive elements between respective characters that make them feel incredibly unique. When picking a vehicle in Twisted Metal, it rarely feels like a choice high above speed and weight class. Vigilante 8's vehicles were incredibly personal. largely because the thought of put into each character's unique special weapon among their shared arsenal. Special weapons in other car combat games sometimes feel like a highly personalized matter of dealing big chunks of damage. But the nuance put into the weapons in Vigilante 8 is insane. Sheila's special weapon, the Tantrum Gun, deals sparing damage but knocks possessed weapons off of enemies' cars, which isn't a benefit many other cars can easily afford, while Molo's bus possesses the Smog Attack, which does insane damage that can make quick work of weaker cars, but is mounted on the back of the bus and can only be aimed backwards, making it a secret weapon that can easily miss and has to be strategically saved for the perfect opportunity. Fighting your way through your rival faction with your character of choice earns you their arcade ending, as is customary for fighting and car combat games. These endings were rather well made for the era. They have the PS1 Tekken-esque plasticiness, but they're rather well directed to compensate. Look how clearly Molo's story comes across. A young aspiring coyote who won it all, and is congratulated by his idols only to be thanked by being put to work washing their cars. The endings developed an extra value when they're connected to the game's sequel, Vigilante 8: Second Offense. Players didn't know it at the time, but contrary to many games with character-unique endings, every ending in Vigilante 8 is canon, and can be sewn together in proper order to tell the canonical story leading up to the sequel. These weren't just indulgences for the character you picked. As is the case for many combat games, car or otherwise, this was how you unlocked, piece by piece, the Vigilante 8 story. You didn't have to wait for the sequel to find out which endings actually happened, because the sequel reveals they all did, and the level of commitment was such that even the sort of ridiculous endings lead to ripples within Second Offense. Take the ending for Coyote Operative Houston, who carves the mind control device out of her arm in an act of defiance, and frees herself of Omar influence once and for all. Directly linked to that one is the ending for Vigilante Slick Clyde, who finds the mind control device and innocuously tries it on, falling under its clutches. These two endings can seem perfectly nonchalant, even gag-adjacent, especially if you happen to beat the game with Clyde before Houston, with the context of canon flexible endings in mind. But in a matter somewhat cathartic and chilling, the release of the sequel confirms that these events are directly linked, canon, and remaining portentous as the brainwashed Clyde acts as the main villain of the second game. Even insane subplots like Dave and Loki's alien hunt, which ends with Loki crashing a UFO, leads to a new character in the sequel, the Garbage Man, who turns out to be an alien stranded by Loki's joyride. He pursues a ride home alongside an astronaut named Bobo, who turns out to be a chimpanzee. It's great. It's freaking great. Now that the narrative has moved thoroughly into the sequel, the characters have all thoroughly progressed. Not every character returns, but the conflict is reignited when the converted and wicked Lord Clyde uses time travel from the far-off year of 2017, yeah, if only, to complete Sid Byrne's work by uniting the remaining coyotes with their futuristic cohorts, forcing the vigilantes into action one last time. Admittedly, I like the lineup of vehicles significantly less in Second Offense, only because such a huge chunk of the cast hails from the future, as do their vehicles, so a lot of that 70s charm is harder to find. That said, there's still some great additions, like Sid Byrne's old flame, Nina Loco, and her snazzy El Camino. The flair of the 70s hasn't been totally forgotten. The stunt-riding all-star trio is a fun, oddball vehicle too, as fragile but nimble as you'd expect a motorcycle in this kind of game to be. The sheer novelty of playing a car combat game in a stretch limo isn't lost on me either, and Lord Clyde making such a great bad guy doesn't hurt, which is why he tends to be my main. Even the future-hailing characters are still pretty well implemented. Dallas 13, the robo-mercenary, could easily be a generic android, but they gave this great touch of him talking like a robotic southern sheriff. It's bizarrely endearing.
Gold vein, bag netted, yellow belly, lily livered, low down, dirty, son of a. I have been bushwhacked.
Second Offense was a strong close to the series. Just like last time, you could place each ending in correct order to follow the sequence of events, and everything is more or less wrapped up in a neat package. Once you've made your semi-trucker fight a jet-fueled future bike, there aren't many ways you can go, so it's understandable that they decided to stomp the brakes then and there. There was a remake exclusive to the Xbox Live Arcade a good number of years later, which was decent, but didn't feel like it was allowed the budget it needed to birth any kind of lasting comeback. That aside, Vigilante 8 is largely a closed book. I'd really love to see new life breathed into this idea, maybe a more complete remake. For a game mostly consisting of cars blowing each other up, the atmosphere and setting is so distinct and movie inspiration so clear that I can't imagine itself not lending itself really well to the expansion-savvy media landscape we're living in. Maybe a series or line of comics is where Vigilante 8 can thrive. Regardless of whether we'll see the title again, it was formative for me in my younger years, and I'll never forget this funky fresh, pistol blasted, latex clad auto rumble.